39 years ago, 45-year-old Susan Tice and 22-year-old Erin Gilmour were sexually assaulted and murdered 4 months apart. And since that time, police have been investigating, linking those two murders to the same person back in 2000, but unable to find the suspect until now.
August 17, 1983, was an ordinary evening in Toronto, Ontario, and a family was setting up the dinner table, awaiting Susan Tice, a 45-year-old mother of 4. It was unlike Susan to not show up without sending any word. As hours passed and Susan didn't arrive, her family grew worried and sent her brother-in-law to check on her. When he arrived at Susan's house, he was shocked to his core when he discovered Susan's body in her bedroom, lying in a pool of blood. Around 4 months after Susan's death, on a chilly night in December, Erin Gilmour's body was found in her apartment by her boyfriend, Anthony Monk.
Toronto native Erin Gilmour was transferred by police to the city morgue this morning. The blonde part-time model was found by a friend about 9:30 last night, tied up in her bed and stabbed in the back. She was found in her second-floor apartment on Hazelton Avenue, located just above a trendy clothing store where she worked as a clerk.
On December 20th, 1983, Anthony was supposed to pick up his 22-year-old girlfriend for their date at around 9 p.m. after her shift at the clothing store she worked at. Anthony arrived a little late, around 9:20 p.m. He walked up to Erin's apartment and discovered her lifeless body wrapped up in a blanket. What really happened to Erin and Susan? Did Erin and Susan know each other? The police and the victims' families have had the same questions for the last 39 years. Welcome to Cold Case Files, where we bring to you the stories of notorious cold cases from history. Today, we will be looking at the cases of Susan Tice and Erin Gilmour, who finally got justice 39 years after their brutal murders, with the help of genetic genealogy. But first, if you haven't subscribed to our channel, please hit the subscribe and like buttons. Now, without any further ado, let's dive into the mystery. Toronto is the capital of the province of Ontario, located in southeastern Canada. Apart from being the most populous city in Canada, it is also a multicultural city and is the country's commercial, financial, and trading center. Toronto is known for its skilled theater, music, and art community, which makes the city a great attraction to all. But this beautiful place is also the home to nearly 700 unsolved murder cases which went cold. And sadly, today we will look at 2 of these horrific crimes that took place back in 1983. It is here in Toronto where our case begins. Susan O'Hara Williscroft Tice, born November 13, 1937, was the daughter of Dr. Burton Williscroft and the former Jane Wallace of Leith. She got married to Fred Tice back in 1961. Susan was 45 and a mother of 4 at the time of her passing in 1983. She was often described by her friends and family as a warm and cheerful person with a beautiful heart who cared deeply for her 4 children, Ben, John, Christian, and Jason. They looked up to her and thought of her as the glue that held everyone together. All her children's friends used to call her Ma or Mrs. T. In July 1983, Susan had divorced her husband, the father of her 4 children, in Calgary, where she worked as a nurse. Soon after that, she decided to move to her hometown and made her way to Toronto. Susan started working here as a family therapist with the families of people with disadvantaged children. Susan and her daughter Christina were very close and shared a special bond. But little did they know that a tragedy was around the corner. It was a peaceful evening on August 17, 1983, and Susan's family was busy setting up the dinner table for a family gathering. Hours passed, but Susan didn't show up, which worried her family. They grew worried, as Susan wasn't like this. She had never not shown up without informing them. They decided to wait for her, but when hours passed and there was still no signs of Susan, her family was convinced that something wasn't right. Susan's brother-in-law hopped in his car and drove to Susan's house on 341 Grace Street to make sure that everything was okay with her. As he reached there, the whole setting looked a bit unusual. There was unopened mail piled up, and all the lights were off, which made it seem like nobody was home. He assumed Susan must not have been home, but still knocked on the door. When nobody answered, he tried to look inside through windows, but it was too dark. He figured that something wasn't right and decided to enter through the back door. He found the door wide open. When he entered Susan's residence, she was nowhere to be found. Her brother-in-law kept looking for her, and suddenly the phone rang. He answered, and it was Christian, Susan's daughter, who was calling from her summer camp. Christian asked her uncle where her mother was, to which he didn't respond, as he had finally found Susan in the upstairs bedroom. There she was, lying unresponsive in a pool of her own blood. Susan's brother-in-law immediately called up the authorities. The police arrived at Susan's residence and immediately got to work. After doing a thorough search in and around the residence, the police found no signs of forced entry. Susan had been sexually assaulted and stabbed multiple times in the chest. The murder weapon was nowhere to be found. The only witness was Susan's neighbor, who had a little bit of information for them. She said that she heard the screams of a woman 4 times around 1:30 a.m. and also heard someone walk by Susan's house.
A next-door neighbor does recall hearing 4 screams and around 1:30 in the morning. So about 15 minutes later, that same neighbor I spoke of that heard the 4 screams did hear somebody walking by.
She didn't, however, think it was anything to call the police about. The only evidence that the police found was a DNA sample obtained from the semen left at the crime scene. This was not enough for the police department to lead them to Susan's killer. The police had no leads or suspects. As there were no suspects in Susan's case, police started questioning everyone in Susan's family and work community to find out whether they knew something about the case. The investigator thought of Susan's ex-husband, Fred Tice, as a possible suspect, but upon finding out his whereabouts at the time the crime was committed, he was soon cleared. The police department was going around in circles. There were no new leads, no suspects or witnesses, and they always seemed to hit a dead end. With hopes of someone coming to them with some kind of information, the police department kept the case open. The detectives were looking for tiny clues or any bits of information which could lead them to Susan's killer. They waited and waited, but nothing came up. The media too covered the case, hoping that someone would show up with some kind of information, but were let down. Susan's case left everyone shocked, not only her family but also the families she worked with. The thought of someone getting away with murder was extremely distressing for Susan's family and the police department. Months passed, but Susan's case looked as if it had reached a dead end. Her case file joined the pile of many other unsolved cold cases which would soon be forgotten. Sadly, Susan's family was left confused without any answers. Susan Tice was buried at Leith United Church Cemetery, Grey County, Ontario, Canada. Erin Harrison Gilmour was born February 3, 1961, and was the daughter of David Gilmour and Anna Gilmour. It was 1983, and Erin was a 22-year-old blonde with a magnetic personality and a bright future. Her brothers, Sean and Kaylin McCowan, described her as an amazing friend to everyone around her, and a natural beauty who was always full of life. She was a career-driven person who still never compromised about spending time with her family. Erin was a happy and intelligent girl. She dreamed of becoming a fashion designer one day and was working at a clothing store called Robin's Knits in 1983. The store was located right below her apartment at 27B on Hazelton Avenue. She worked there to gain experience in the industry and build on her experience as a designer and as a model. At the time, she was dating Anthony Monk. Anthony was the son of Peter Monk, who was her father, David Gilmour's business partner. Erin Gilmour was the only child of David Gilmour, a business tycoon who made his fortune through starting one of the largest coal mining companies in the world. Erin and her father were extremely close and spent a great deal of time together. They had no idea that tragedy was waiting for them just around the corner. Just 4 months after Susan's murder, 5 days before Christmas on December 20th, 1983, Erin Gilmour was also found dead. On the night of December 19th, 1983, Erin had called her 2 half-brothers, Sean and Kalen McCowan, over for a sleepover at her apartment on Hazelton Avenue. This was like a ritual for all 3 of them, and both of the brothers used to enjoy Erin's company. Christmas was around the corner, and everyone was excited about the festive season. They spent the night watching movies and eating popcorn before going to bed. The next morning, Erin dropped Kalen home and Sean at the market as he had some shopping to do for Christmas. Little did he know that this was the last time he'd see his sister alive and well. After returning home, Erin began her shift at Robin's Knits and continued her day as any other. At the end of her shift around 9 p.m., she was supposed to close the store, meaning she'd be the last person there. Erin's boyfriend, Anthony Monk, had promised to pick her up from the store for their date at 9 p.m., but as he stopped to withdraw some cash from an ATM, he was about 20 minutes late. He was expecting Erin to be waiting for him outside the store, but when he reached there, he didn't see her. Anthony assumed that she had gone upstairs to get ready for their date. Anthony took the stairs leading to Erin's apartment. He found the main door open, which seemed odd to him. It was unlike Erin to be so careless, but he thought that maybe she had left the door open for him. As Anthony walked in and looked around, he couldn't find Erin. He called out her name multiple times, but Erin didn't respond. Anthony opened the door to the bedroom. She wasn't there either. But there was a blanket rolled up right in the middle of the bed. Anthony walked towards it and pulled on the edges of the blanket, fearing the worst. And his worst fears were confirmed. There was Erin, wrapped up in a blanket, not responding. Anthony didn't understand what had happened until he saw the blood spreading out on the bed from under the blanket. Anthony was terrified and, without wasting a second, called up the police. When the police reached Erin's apartment, they noted that she had been left wrapped up in a blanket after being killed. Erin, too, was a victim of sexual assault and murder. Here, too, police found DNA evidence in the form of semen at the crime scene. When the police examined the crime scene, they didn't find any signs of a break-in or forced entry. Erin had been strangled and stabbed multiple times in the chest. There were no suspects or witnesses, and the murder weapon wasn't found anywhere. What shocked the police department the most was the fact that everything that happened with Erin that night happened within a span of only 20 minutes. Between Erin closing the store at 9 p.m. and Anthony arriving at 9:20 p.m., the culprit was able to assault and murder Erin and escape without a trace. With the amount of evidence and information the police had, finding Erin's killer was going to be a tough job for them. What made Erin's case different from Susan's was the amount of publicity and media attention it garnered. Erin Gilmour was the only child of the business tycoon David Gilmour, who was a well-known figure in Toronto back then. The police questioned Erin's family and colleagues initially and found nothing odd. Anthony, Erin's boyfriend, was thought to be a suspect in Erin's case, as the police thought that Erin might have known her killer since they had covered her body in a blanket, something killers do to help subdue their guilt. But eventually, Anthony was cleared and eliminated as a suspect. The investigation seemed to be leading nowhere. The police were now desperate to catch this horrific killer. The publicity on Erin's case brought in a lot of new leads and suspects. The investigators questioned over 700 people in connection to Erin's case, but all were eliminated one by one. Due to the lack of evidence or any proof, the police were unable to find a potential suspect. Going around in circles, Erin's case also went cold. Initially, the police didn't connect Susan and Erin's cases to each other, but found the similarities eerie. It wasn't until 2000 that the police discovered a link between these two cases. Using the advanced DNA developing technology, the police were able to conclude that Susan and Erin were assaulted and killed by the same person. Using the DNA samples collected from both crime scenes, the investigators noted that the DNA samples obtained from both crime scenes were a perfect match. The two DNA samples were an identical match to each other, but there were no other matches in the Canadian DNA database. This gave rise to a lot of new questions. The police department were now curious to find out whether this man was responsible for any more crimes back in the 1980s, if he had struck before, if he had struck ever since 1983, and if he was still on the loose. In November 2008, the Toronto Police Department announced a $50,000 reward for anyone who had any information which could help the police find the murderer of Erin and Susan. But sadly, it had been so many years since the crime actually took place that not many remembered or knew about it. The publicity surrounding these cases had significantly declined over the last few decades. The police department eagerly hoped for an informant to show up, but when that never happened, Erin's family chipped in and the reward was increased to $200,000 in 2012. But even that reward went unclaimed. Even though the world had lost any hope of ever finding Erin and Susan's killer, there was a group of detectives who were determined to bring them justice. Police even received a tip that indicated that both Erin and Susan frequently visited bars and restaurants in the Yorkville area where they might have met their killer. Police determined that since both were murdered in their own homes and there were no signs of a break-in, the killer figured out where they both lived and started to follow them or knew the women personally. But this was merely one of the many possibilities of how the crimes took place. Erin Gilmour's brothers Sean McCowan and Kaylin McCowan kept in constant touch with Detective Sergeant Steve Smith. Ever since the police were able to link the murders of Erin and Susan in 2000, the case started to make slow progress, but still remained in the pile of cold cases.
I was 13 and she was 22 at the time. She was 9 years older. I and my brother were like the proverbial little brothers who got strapped along on her excursions.
My name's Kaylin McCowan and Erin Gilmour was my sister. It's kind of hard to sum up how the presence of my sister, but she was just beautiful and kind and warm.
In the month of March in 2016, the investigators released a YouTube video urging people to come forward with any information they had. This, yet again, led nowhere. Later, in 2020, Sean and Kaylin McGowan reached out to Detective Smith and asked if genetic genealogy could be used to track down their sister's killer. Little did they know that the police department was already working on this. In 2019, the investigators had made use of forensic genetic genealogy with aid from Othram, an American corporation which specializes in using forensic genealogy to resolve unsolved murders, disappearances, and identification of unidentified murder victims. Othram then prepared a broad DNA profile using forensic-grade genome sequencing with only the tiny strands of DNA which had been collected at the crime scenes. Toronto police were now rustling through the DNA profiles which had already been uploaded on various Canadian DNA databases, hoping to find a match which could lead them to at least a distant relative of the killer. And in 2022, using the broad DNA profile developed by Othram, the detectives were able to trace the DNA back to two sets of grandparents. Hence, they figured out that whoever killed Erin and Susan was related to one of these four people. Without wasting any time, the detectives got to work and started scanning the family tree thoroughly until they got to one family branch which seemed highly likely to be that of the killer. This family branch led the investigators to a generation of 5 brothers. The Toronto Police Department was finally able to make a list of possible suspects and had narrowed it down to these 5 brothers. They were quite sure that one of these 5 brothers had killed Erin and Susan, but without getting a DNA sample from all of the brothers, it would not be possible to determine which one the killer might be. It wasn't going to be easy for the police department to collect the DNA of these 5 brothers, as they couldn't directly collect it without a court order. And with the little amount of evidence they had, the court wouldn't issue them a warrant. The Toronto Police Department resorted to collecting the DNA samples of the 5 brothers inconspicuously through beer cans and glasses and other sources. They were able to successfully collect DNA samples of 4 brothers, but couldn't get their hands on the 5th sample. The 5th brother was Joseph George Sutherland. The investigators ran a test on all the DNA samples they had collected and were able to eliminate all the 4 brothers as the killer, one by one. The investigators were now sure that Joseph was the killer, but they still needed his DNA sample to prove it. The Toronto Police Department then came up with a plan. Using the samples they had collected of the 4 other brothers, the detectives asked for a warrant based on the fact that all the other brothers were eliminated as suspects, and that the 5th brother was most likely the killer of Susan and Erin. Looking at the research, the investigation, and the progress made by the detectives in the case, the judge agreed and issued a warrant to the detectives, which allowed them to demand a DNA sample from Joseph Sutherland. They all rushed to Joseph's current residence in Moosonee in Ontario and collected his DNA sample. When the results came back, the detectives heaved a sigh of relief. They had finally got their man. Joseph's DNA sample came back as an exact match to the one found at Susan and Erin's crime scenes. Susan and Erin's killer finally had a name and a face after nearly 40 years of pain and suffering. Joseph George Sutherland was born in December 1961 in Fort Albany, Ontario. He had recently been residing in Moosonee, Ontario. Joseph attended Northern Lights Secondary School in Moosonee and Humber College in Etobicoke, Ontario. All this time, he had been living a simple life in Moosonee, roughly 850 kilometers north of Toronto. He was quite active on his social media accounts. He was accused of allegedly killing and sexually assaulting Susan Tice and Erin Gilmour. If he was indeed the murderer, then at the time of committing the murders of Erin and Susan, Joseph was only 21 years old. On November 24, 2022, the police arrived at Joseph Sutherland's Moosonee residence and arrested him. At age 61, on November 25, 2022,
going through this case, I'll tell you that the only way that this was solved was the advances in science. We're able to use investigative genetic genealogy to narrow down a suspect family, and from there, we were able to narrow down a suspect who is obviously under arrest today.
Joseph was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder of Erin Gilmour and Susan Tice. He is currently being held as an inmate in the Toronto South Detention Center as he awaits his trial. It has also been noted that Joseph does not have any previous criminal records, which explains why his DNA data wasn't available in the Canadian DNA database. Sean and Kaylin McCowan were extremely relieved when they heard about Joseph's arrest. Sean received a call from Detective Smith informing him about the arrest, and he was beyond happy. He recalled that there were a lot of happy tears and a lot of swearing, but there was finally relief. Sean remembered that the day when his mother told him about his sister's murder, he punched a hole in the wall out of rage. He only wished that his mother, who passed away 2 years ago, was here right now to see this day. Susan's only daughter, Christian, is now a mother herself. When she heard the news of her mother's killer finally being found and arrested, she felt at peace. She only wished that Susan was here today to meet her grandchildren. Christian remembered how traumatized she was back in 1983 when she lost her mother. She would often go to her mother's house and walk up and down the stairs, trying to figure out what exactly had happened. Even today, out of fear, Christian sleeps with a baseball bat in the corner of her room as she is concerned for her safety. But all that had finally come to an end. Christian gave her mother's picture a fist bump and said, "We got him," upon hearing the news. Ann Chisholm, now 85, was Susan's best friend back in the day. They met as teenagers in Camp Wapameyo at Algonquin Provincial Park. Ann had met Susan the weekend before she was killed and had plans to meet her again the next weekend as well. Ann expressed her grief, saying how sad and disheartening it is that she got to have a wonderful life in all these years, but her best friend Susan was robbed of the same opportunity. Anne, too, felt relieved when Joseph's arrest was made. When asked about Joseph's reaction upon being arrested, Detective Smith stated that it seemed like he saw it coming.
Now, that suspect has been in Ontario for 39 years since these murders, so obviously we're going to look into every possible connection to any possible case throughout Ontario to ensure that he isn't responsible for any other offenses.
He knew that after committing such crimes, he couldn't hide forever, and that someday he'd be caught. And that day had come. Detective Smith also stated that in his 25 years of working with Toronto police, this was the most complex case that they had worked. The Toronto Police Department has stated that they're running a check on all the other cold murder cases in Ontario to see if Joseph is connected to any of them, as Joseph had been living in Ontario for the last 39 years. Susan Tice and Erin Gilmour were two beautiful and hard-working souls whose lives were cut short abruptly. But now they can both rest easy, as after a long journey through struggle and pain, the police were able to put their killer behind bars. Technological advancement in genetic genealogy helped the detectives and played a major role in solving this case. With the help of a tiny strand of DNA, the detectives were able to narrow down a potential suspect family and then worked their way down to a single suspect. Genetic genealogy is a technology that is constantly improving and making great progress. In the future, it will surely play an important role in the cracking of many cold cases like this. Do you think Joseph could have been connected to more unsolved murders in Ontario? What do you think could have driven Joseph to commit such crimes at such a young age? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section. Do not forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Until next time, stay safe, and thanks for watching.